Somewhere in a NASA archive, there is a photograph that made grown scientists reach for the word monument. Not a UFO blogger, not a fringe YouTube channel, a government space agency in a press briefing, staring at a shadow on the lunar surface and struggling to explain what it was looking at. That moment happened. It is documented. And it is only the first of at least 3 times in the last 60 years that the people responsible for exploring the moon looked at their own data and could not immediately rule out the impossible. What you are about to hear is not a story about aliens. It is a story about something stranger, how 3 separate generations, using 3 completely different technologies, all stumbled into the same haunted corner of human imagination, and what happened when the truth finally caught up with each of them. Let's start with the year most people don't know this story even begins. Not 2007, not the age of viral video. 1966, the Cold War is at its peak, the United States is racing the Soviet Union to the moon, and NASA has just sent an unmanned probe called Lunar Orbiter 2 to photograph potential landing sites for the Apollo program. On November 20th of that year, the probe captures a routine image of a region near the Sea of Tranquility. The same site, coincidentally, where Apollo 11 would land 3 years later. Nothing about the assignment is unusual, but when the photograph reaches the analysts on the ground, something in it stops them cold. There are shadows in the image that do not behave the way shadows should. 6 of them cast by objects on the surface, stretching out long and thin and sharp, nothing like the soft, rounded shadows a boulder throws. According to informed accounts from that period, one unnamed scientist looked at the image and reached for a description, no, professional once attached to their name. He called it the Valley of Monuments. Read that again. A NASA-adjacent scientist, in an internal reaction to raw satellite data, used the word monuments. Not a headline writer, not a tabloid, a person examining the actual photograph. The Washington Post picked it up almost immediately, running a piece describing 6 mysterious, statuesque shadows, and within days, Newsweek followed. The objects looked to the human eye disturbingly like a formation of standing spires, something closer to an Egyptian obelisk field than a random scatter of lunar rock. And this is where the story gets its scientific credibility, because the man who pushed the analysis further wasn't a conspiracy theorist. He was William Blair, a researcher attached to Boeing's own biotechnology division, working in direct proximity to NASA's exobiology research. Blair didn't just glance at the photo and move on. He got out a compass and a protractor. He measured the angles between the 7 shadow-casting objects and found something that should not exist in a random geological formation. A right-angle coordinate structure, isosceles triangles, and internal geometry that looked deliberate. Think about what that means. This wasn't pattern matching by an amateur, desperate to see a face in the static. This was a trained scientist, using instruments, finding actual angular regularity in data that was supposed to be nothing more than volcanic debris. Blair went further still, noting what appeared to be a 70-foot rectangular depression sitting just west of the tallest spire, a shape he compared, in his own analysis, to an excavation whose walls had partially collapsed inward. Not a crater, not an impact scar, an excavation. The press ran with it, the public absorbed it. And the phrase that stuck to this formation for the next half-century was born in that news cycle, the Blair Cuspids. Named after the man who measured them, treated for years afterward as the moon's most credible anomaly, because unlike almost everything that would come after it, this one had actual scientific fingerprints on it from day one. But here's where it gets worse, because the story doesn't end with Blair's measurements. It ends with silence. NASA never issued the kind of thunderous, definitive dismissal you'd expect if this were nothing. What actually happened, according to researchers who tracked the story for decades afterward, is that the explanation trickled out slowly, almost reluctantly, through USGS geologists working on contract for NASA's Langley Research Center. Scientists like Thor Karlstrom offered competing theories: volcanic ejecta from fault lines in the lunar crust, eroded remnants of ancient cones, ordinary boulders throwing unusually long shadows because of the low angle of the sun at that specific moment in the lunar day. Multiple explanations. None of them a single unified, confident answer. And when there is no single unified answer from the institution holding the only cameras capable of checking, the myth doesn't die. It goes dormant. That's the pattern you need to hold on to, because it's about to repeat itself twice more, decades apart, in completely different eras of technology. And each time, the shape of the mystery adapts to whatever medium is dominant at that moment in history. Fast forward to 2011. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, LRO, is in position around the moon with imaging resolution that Blair could not have dreamed of in 1966. Researchers point it directly at the coordinates of the original Cuspids photograph, hunting for the same formation under different lighting. They get their images, 4 separate high-resolution passes, across different months, different sun angles, different years. And what those images show, according to the analysts who compiled the comparison, is that the towering spires simply are not towers at all. Under proper resolution and different lighting geometry, the same features resolve into ordinary surface topology. No artificial spires, no excavation walls, nothing that survives contact with better cameras. The mystery that captivated Newsweek in 1966 was, in the end, a limitation of 1960s optics colliding with human pattern recognition under low light. 45 years of imagination, closed out by pixel density, and you'd think that would be the end of it. A clean resolution. Case closed, structure debunked, everyone moves on. Except that is not how this works. Because the underlying hunger, the desire to believe that something is being kept from the public, doesn't disappear when one specific claim gets falsified. It simply waits for the next platform to carry it. That platform arrived in April of 2007, and this time, it didn't come from a government agency's own confused analysts. It came from a YouTube account. A username surfaced calling itself Retired FB. Over a period of weeks, this account began uploading video after video, presenting what it claimed was leaked footage from a mission called Apollo 20, a mission the public had never heard of, supposedly flown in secret in August of 1976, 4 years after the last official Apollo landing. Think about the audacity of that claim for a moment. Officially, the Apollo program ended with Apollo 17 in December of 1972. This new account was asserting that NASA had continued flying crewed lunar missions for 4 more years, in complete secrecy, and that the reason for the secrecy wasn't cost-cutting or political will. It was because Apollo 20 had discovered something the public was never meant to see. Weeks later, a man calling himself William Rutledge gave an interview, conducted notably, not in person, but over instant messenger, in which he claimed to be the commander of this phantom mission. He said Apollo 20 launched jointly with the Soviet Union from Vandenberg Air Force Base. He said his crew included a Soviet cosmonaut and an American engineer from Bell Labs. And he said their mission wasn't to plant another flag. It was to investigate something Apollo 15 had already photographed from orbit in 1971. A massive, cigar-shaped object resting inside a crater on the far side of the moon, one so large that observers were calling it a mothership. According to Rutledge's footage, his crew didn't just photograph the object, they landed near it. They entered it. And inside, they said, they found a body, a partially preserved humanoid figure they nicknamed Mona Lisa, found alongside what appeared to be a wrecked spacecraft far older than anything human engineers had built. This is not chaos. To the audience discovering it in 2007, this felt like structure, a story with a beginning, a location, named crew members, a motive for the cover-up, and grainy but seemingly authentic footage to back it all up. It spread across early YouTube and forum culture at a speed the platform had rarely seen for a space story. And it survived in various forms for years because, unlike the Blair cuspids, this story wasn't waiting on a government agency to explain itself. It was self-contained. It didn't need NASA's silence to grow. It thrived specifically because NASA said almost nothing about it at all. But watch what happens when someone actually starts pulling the thread. Because this is where the entire structure collapses in on itself, piece by piece, in a way the original 1966 story never did. The starting point of the whole account, the mothership photograph, was real. NASA had genuinely released that Apollo 15 image, but independent researchers went back to the raw, high-resolution version of it, the same way LRO would later be used against the Blair cuspids, and found that the cigar-shaped object was nothing more than a long ridge of lunar terrain, catching deep shadow at a specific angle. A natural feature, not fabricated by NASA, misread by everyone who saw only the low-resolution copy circulating online. Then, the physical evidence in Rutledge's own videos started falling apart under scrutiny. Bloggers ran side-by-side comparisons between the spacecraft interior shown in the Apollo 20 footage and the actual Apollo 17 command module, which, crucially, is not lost, not classified, not hidden. It sits on public display at Space Center Houston, where anyone can walk up and photograph it. And when researchers compared the porthole shown in the leaked footage to the real, physically accessible module, the handle position gave it away instantly. It was open, in a way that would never be survivable in the vacuum of actual spaceflight. It wasn't evidence of a hidden mission. It was evidence someone had filmed inside a replica, or the genuine article under conditions that made no sense for an actual crewed flight. And then came the detail that should have ended the story permanently, and largely did, among anyone paying close attention. The man behind the Retired FB account was eventually identified as a special effects and modeling artist. He later admitted, publicly, that Apollo 20 was fabricated from the beginning, a mixture of real historical imagery, home-built models, and a fictional narrative he had constructed for the internet age. He had even written a companion science fiction novel echoing the same plot, essentially confessing through fiction what the videos never admitted directly. So here is where you'd expect the pattern to break. 2 data points down. 1966's cuspids, dismantled by 2011's imaging technology. 2007's Apollo 20, dismantled by its own creator's admission. Surely a third generation, growing up saturated in fact-checking culture, immune to hoaxes, wouldn't fall into the exact same trap a third time. They did. And this time, extraordinarily, the institution itself walked straight into it. Move forward again to December of 2019 and shift your attention away from NASA entirely. Because this next chapter doesn't belong to the United States. It belongs to China's National Space Administration, and specifically to a rover named Yutu-2, whose name translates to Jade Rabbit. Yutu-2 had done something no machine from any nation had ever done before. It had landed on the far side of the moon, the hemisphere permanently turned away from Earth, as part of the Chang'e 4 mission. It was crawling slowly across the floor of the von Karman crater, inside the enormous South Pole Aitken Basin, sending back data that scientists were using to study material that might have originated in the lunar mantle itself. And then, during a routine drive, its cameras caught something on the horizon that made even its own ground controllers pause. A cube. A sharply geometric, distinctly rectangular shape, sitting roughly 80 meters away, silhouetted against the lunar sky in a way that looked nothing like the soft, irregular rubble surrounding it. Here's what most people don't realize about this moment, and it's the detail that separates this story from the two before it. This wasn't a leaked YouTube account or an anonymous internal murmur picked up by a newspaper decades later. This came directly from China's own state-affiliated science communication channel, an outlet called Our Space, operating with the approval of the government space agency itself. They posted the image. They called it, in their own words, a mystery hut. And they announced openly that Yutu-2 would be diverting its route specifically to drive toward it and investigate. Global headlines exploded within hours. A cube-shaped object on the dark side of the moon, spotted by an active national space mission, with the space agency itself publicly confirming the anomaly and promising to send a rover directly to it. This had none of the deniability of Rutledge's grainy hoax footage. It had an 80-meter countdown and a government press release. And this is where everything changes, because now you have an actual live experiment running in real time. Not old, contested archival photographs, a rover physically crawling across the regolith toward a specific coordinate, with the entire space-following public watching the distance close. It took roughly 2 to 3 lunar days, the equivalent of 2 to 3 months on Earth, because a single lunar day-night cycle lasts around 29 Earth days, for Yutu-2 to physically close that 80-meter gap. Solar-powered, it had to hibernate through each freezing lunar night and wake again with the sunrise before it could keep crawling toward the object. Imagine the tension of that waiting period if you were someone who wanted to believe. An object identified as geometrically anomalous by the very agency operating the rover, and the only way to get a final answer required literally driving a solar-powered robot across an alien landscape, one slow week at a time, through repeated blackouts of total lunar night. In January of 2022, more than 2 years after the first sighting, Yutu-2 finally arrived close enough to resolve the object clearly. Specifically, according to the rover's own drive team, a small boulder sitting on the rim of a crater, its shape distorted into apparent geometric perfection purely by the combination of distance, low resolution, and the angle of shadow at the moment it was first photographed. Once the rover closed the distance, the cube resolved into something almost comically mundane, a lumpy, elongated rock that the ground team began calling Jade Rabbit, in a nod to the rover's own name, joking that it resembled a rabbit crouched at the crater's edge, complete with smaller fragments nearby that looked, in their own words, like rabbit droppings. The likely origin, according to the scientists analyzing it, was simple lunar geology. A boulder excavated from beneath the surface by an ancient impact millions of years earlier, sitting exposed on the crater rim, exactly where a violent collision would have thrown it. 3 completely different eras, 3 completely different technologies. 1960s, photographic plates, 2000s consumer video hoaxing, 2020s, state-run robotic exploration, 3 completely different institutional actors, an American Cold War space agency, an anonymous internet user, and a modern Chinese national space program. And in every single case, the exact same psychological arc played out. An object that should not exist under low resolution or long distance resolves into ordinary rock the instant a better camera or closer approach becomes available. What most people are not seeing when they encounter any one of these stories in isolation is that pattern. They see the individual claim, get captivated by the individual mystery, and never zoom out far enough to notice that this has now happened at least 3 times across 60 years, on 2 different sides of the Cold War divide, and then again on the other side of the 21st century US-China space race. And it has resolved the exact same way every single time. So why does it keep happening? That's the real story here. Not whether there is a structure on the moon, but why the human mind, generation after generation, keeps manufacturing one out of shadow and distance. Part of the answer is genuinely rooted in how vision works under extreme lighting conditions. On the moon, there's no atmosphere to scatter light and soften shadows the way Earth's air does. Every shadow on the lunar surface is a hard-edged, razor-sharp cut between blinding white sunlight and absolute black. Under those conditions, at low resolution, an ordinary boulder can throw a shadow many times, longer than the rock itself, and that shadow, when it's the only visual information you have, can very easily be mistaken for the object rather than the artifact the object casts. Blair wasn't hallucinating in 1966. He was measuring shadows using instruments designed for a world where shadow length reliably indicates something about the object casting it. On Earth, that assumption mostly holds. In near vacuum, at a low sun angle, it can betray you completely. The second half of the answer is institutional, and this is the part that actually deserves scrutiny. Not because there's a hidden structure, but because of how badly transparency was handled at each stage. In 1966, NASA's non-answer, the trickle of competing unofficial USGS theories instead of one authoritative statement, is exactly the kind of vacuum that allows a story to survive for 45 years instead of 45 days. In 2007, the absence of any real official response to an obviously fabricated claim let it circulate unchallenged for far longer than the evidence should have allowed. It took citizen researchers, not government scientists, to actually dismantle Rutledge's footage frame by frame. And in 2019, ironically, the closest thing to a truly transparent real-time debunking in this entire 60-year history came from the one actor people are often most suspicious of. A state space agency that posted the anomaly, publicly announced its plan to investigate, and then published the mundane result 2 years later without trying to bury either the sighting or the disappointing resolution. Read that again, because it inverts almost everyone's assumption about which institutions hide things and which ones don't. The most secretive-seeming photographic mystery from 1966 took 45 years and an entirely new orbital imaging platform to properly close. The most recent one, run by a government many Western audiences assume to be the least transparent, closed itself out publicly in real time, sighting to resolution, with the state's own outlet documenting every step, including the anticlimax. Now hold that thought against what's actually happening today, in 2026, because this old mythology isn't a relic. It's colliding head-on with the most intense period of lunar exploration in human history. NASA's Artemis program is pushing crewed missions back toward the lunar surface for the first time. The Apollo era, targeting the South Pole specifically because of the water ice locked in permanently shadowed craters there. China's Chang'e program is advancing toward its own crewed lunar ambitions and a planned international lunar research station, positioning itself as a genuine rival architecture to Artemis rather than a follower. India's Chandrayaan missions have already put a lander at the lunar South Pole. Private companies are landing robotic missions on commercial contracts. There are more cameras, more sensors, more national space agencies, and more independent researchers scrutinizing lunar imagery right now than at any point since Apollo, which means, statistically, the next Mystery Hut moment isn't a question of if. It's a question of when and which agency's rover finds it. And this is exactly why the timing of a title like the one that sparked this entire investigation, the one you may have arrived here chasing, matters so much. It reflects a real appetite, a completely legitimate hunger to believe that with this many nations, this many robots, this many high-resolution cameras suddenly crawling across the lunar surface simultaneously, surely something has to turn up that doesn't fit. Surely, out of that flood of new imagery, one anomaly survives contact with a closer look. So far, across 60 years, across 3 separate technological eras, across 2 rival superpowers, across a state-sanctioned press release and an anonymous internet hoax and a Cold War photographic panic, it hasn't. Every single structure the moon has offered up so far has, on closer inspection, been geology, shadow, and distance conspiring with human pattern recognition. Not fabrication by the agencies involved, not evidence of concealment. A remarkably consistent, remarkably human tendency to see design in the dark, and a remarkably consistent institutional failure across every era and every nation to communicate that resolution quickly or clearly enough before the myth outran the correction. But here's the uncomfortable part, the part that keeps this story from ever fully closing. Every single time this pattern has repeated, the debunking has depended entirely on getting a better camera closer to the object. A higher resolution orbital pass, a rover physically crawling for 2 years across broken terrain, an independent researcher with the patience to compare archival negatives frame by frame. Which means the pattern only holds as strong as our next generation of instruments. Every cube, every spire, every monument identified so far has been an artifact of insufficient resolution. That is true, and it is documented, and it should reassure you. But it is also, if you think about it for a moment longer, not quite the same thing as certainty that resolution will always be the answer. It is simply the answer every single time we have actually had the patience and the technology to look closely enough to find out. So as Artemis prepares to put boots back on the regolith for the first time in half a century, as Chang'e pushes toward a permanent lunar research station, as a new generation of orbiters maps the surface at resolutions Blair or Rutledge or the U-22 engineers could never have imagined, the real question isn't whether NASA or China or anyone else is hiding a structure on the moon. 60 years of evidence says they're not, and that when their own instruments briefly suggested otherwise, the resolution came from better data, not better secrecy. The real question is what happens the day the pattern breaks. What happens if, out of the thousands of new images about to come flooding back from the most crowded era of lunar exploration in history, something appears that doesn't resolve into rock the moment the camera gets close enough? We have been here before, 3 times in 3 different eras, under 3 different flags. Each time the shadow won, and the mundane explanation arrived, eventually, later than it should have. The instruments keep getting better. The cameras keep getting closer. And somewhere out there, right now, a rover or an orbiter from one nation or another is quietly gathering the next set of images that someone, somewhere, is going to look at, and for just a moment, wonder if this is finally the time the shadow doesn't move.